Clark Datchler is the voice, songwriter, and co-founder of Johnny Hates Jazz, the band whose debut album, Turn Back the Clock, produced hits including Shattered Dreams, I Don't Want to Be a Hero, and, of course, the title track, taking them from Britain to international success. But Clark's story is also about what happened when he walked away from that success and what brought him back. In this interview, he talks about songwriting, fame, leaving Johnny Hates Jazz at their peak, environmentalism, the search for something more meaningful in life, and what it means to return to the songs that changed your life. Clark Datchler, welcome. I want to go straight into this because you come from a family, a musical family essentially, because your father, who was a singer and saxophonist, was with bands, the Stargazers and the Polka Dots, and very successful. So I'm just wondering, when you grew up, I'm not sure at what era of his career that would have been when you were growing up, but when you grew up, how was success presented in your family? Was it something glamorous or was it just work?
No, it wasn't glamorous at all. And the reason for that, Steve, is that you just touched on it. My dad's success actually came about before I was born. The Stargazers, his first band, had their own radio show on the BBC, which was the equivalent of a TV show these days. And so they were really big. They were the first British band to have a number one hit on the British chart. And then when he was part of the Polka Dots, which he was much happier with, they were a proper close harmony, great jazz vocal group. They performed and recorded with Frank Sinatra, with Ella Fitzgerald, Petula Clark, Joe Stafford, Sarah Vaughan. He sang on "I Am the Walrus" in the chorus, and worked with a very young Jimmy Page before there was such a thing as Led Zeppelin, when Jimmy Page was just a session player. So he had this huge history. But by the time the early 60s came about and the rise of rock and roll was happening, the jazz world kind of got put out of business for a long while. And so dad was already kind of transitioning into a different line of work as well as music. And so he was very humble. He was that generation, World War II generation. They never blew their own trumpet. They were very low key. And it took me years to prize it out of him as to just how well he'd done.
Yeah, and also success is sometimes an identification factor for the person. Do you know what I mean? When success goes, it can be a little difficult. So I just wondered whether I don't know if this is the right word, whether he suffered under that.
I think quietly he did, but on the surface, he carried himself incredibly well. And he did his best to give us the best upbringings we could have, me and my brothers. But um, but really, when it came about, when I saw the pain that I think a lot of that jazz world experience was when we talked about the Beatles, and I would enthuse over them, and he wouldn't. And in fact, he wouldn't, to the point where I didn't realize how painful it was for him, because the Beatles had essentially put him out of business, and everyone's focus shifted towards them and the Kinks and the Who and everything else. And ironically, firstly, I was too young and stupid to realize that that's what was happening. But also, on the flip side, I remember when he heard Ella Fitzgerald's version of "Can't Buy Me Love," which was a very cool version. He changed his perspective. He kind of began to acknowledge that Lennon and McCartney were great songwriters. He might not have ever liked the records very much, but he did appreciate their songwriting prowess.
Did you ever feel pressure to live up to him?
No, because he never put that on me. He was, like I say, very humble, very low key. And even when I remember he wanted me to go to music school because he could see I had some kind of innate ability. And I went for an audition at the Barbican in London and failed miserably. I froze. I was absolutely terrified. And he saw that, and rather than make a big deal out of it. He let me kind of cool out, and then he got me an audition at Leeds College of Music, which back then was the only jazz college and the premier jazz college, music college in the country. And I passed. I was offered a place when I was 14. And I still decided that I wasn't going to go eventually because I wanted to get into making records, and he accepted that. But he would encourage me in the ways that he felt I would respond to. So I did not grow up in any kind of showbiz inclined family at all. That everyone was pretty low key.
I've seen an interview with you where you talk about your love of the Beatles and you talk about the song Nowhere Man.
Mm,
And I think it's quite fascinating that, in a sense, your father was left behind by the change of style of music.
yeah.
And that can give you a fear of success, in a sense. And Nowhere Man, in a sense, is about, not having an impact.
Yeah, totally. And it really resonated with me. I mean, I grew up in kind of the stockbroker belt of Surrey, which is for some reasons where the jazzers ended up gravitating towards. That was the countryside to them because they all came from London, the ones that I was around. Um, and that felt at that time very much like you were on, very chosen paths to achieve adulthood and have a family and a career and a business and or be an employee. And there wasn't, I never thought there was anything wrong in that, but it wasn't for me. So that's why it resonated so much with me, apart from the fact that Nowhere Man for me was the transition between early Beatles and later Beatles. And there's something about the whole feel of it, which still reminds me of early Beatles, the way Ringo plays so behind the beat. It's so cool. He was and is one of the great players. Amazing. McCartney's melodic bass playing is still second to none. And yet somehow the way John wrote that song, it was heading towards something else that would manifest itself more on albums like Revolver and Sergeant Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour. So I always that song is always special to me.
You wrote songs when you were very young. I understand you wrote your first song when you were 8, and you wrote in your diary something like you would be successful one day. Can you remember the exact words you wrote?
Yeah, actually, I said one day I'll be a successful musician like my dad because I looked up to him, and because he introduced me to the jazz greats, I wanted to be like them. Um, and my brothers were into soul music, so I used to listen to a lot of R&B. Stevie Wonder was one of my heroes as well. Early, Stevie from the 70s was the business. Um, but yeah, I started writing young, and they're probably dreadful songs. But it's something that I stuck with, and I listened and listened and listened to the people who came before, whether that be Rodgers and Hammerstein, or whether it was Lennon and McCartney, or these great writers, Page and Plant, Stevie, Marvin Gaye, Maurice White, all these amazing people. And 10cc, I must give a nod to 10cc, who were my favorite band for a long time. By listening to them, I learned how to write. There was a lot of trial and error. I mean, the idea of writing a song, recording it in your bedroom and putting it on Spotify so millions of people could hear it the next day was unheard of. We had to really graft and deal with a lot of rejection. And that rejection was well founded because in many respects, because the A&R people at the record labels just kept saying, not good enough, not good enough, not good enough, do better, like a kind of a headmaster. And it made me try harder and refine my ability to the point where I actually started to get pretty good. So I think I was very fortunate to be on the trajectory I was at that period of time when the record industry still nurtured, for want of a better phrase, talent.
I just want to go back to that sentence that you want to be a successful musician. And I may have read a lot into that doing this research. And today I was thinking, oh, I wonder whether you wanting success at 8 years old was in any form of compensation to your father. Not for, you know what I mean? Like, because he lost his uh, success, but he found still what he really loved.
Yeah, I think there was an element of that. And I think it's it's this concept of um, generational uh, repetitiveness in a way. So my dad reached a certain level of success, which was big. I think actually it was bigger than what I achieved, but uh, to my mind. But in a way, I wanted to. I think I did want to build on that. I wanted to do it in my time and in with the accoutrements of that era of the, especially growing up in the 70s. It was hugely influential for a young lad like myself. But yes, I think that's true. And I also felt, I wanted my dad to be proud of me. I wanted him to recognize my abilities because he always did. But I would say that when I had my first hit with Johnny Hates Jazz, Shattered Dreams, and he was the first person to hear it. He heard it being written in the very room that I'm in right now, actually, on a piano over there. He came in and he said, and he never used to do this, always gave me space. He said, "What's that you're working on?" And I said, "I'm going to call it Shattered Dreams, Dad." And he went quiet and he said, "I think you've written your first hit." And that meant a huge amount coming from him because subsequently most of the record industry thought I was on a, I had come up with a complete loser. So he could see that, and that always meant a lot to me.
What do you think that he could hear in it than others couldn't then?
I think that he came from an era where the song was king. And to me and my colleague Mike in Johnny Hates Jazz, we still say that every now and again. The song is king. You got to get the song right and you got to respect it because that's the ship within which you sail. You've then got to turn it into a good record, of course, and that's no easy thing. But the song has to be right. Songs back then in my dad's era, the jazz era, they were written by external songwriters, whether it be a single person or a team of two people, and they came from a lineage that stretched all the way back to the great classical composers. There's a wonderful photograph of, I think it's Gershwin, standing beside a piano at which Maurice Ravel, the great French composer, is playing. And that is the baton being handed. And so, for me, I grew up with a very disciplined sense of melody and structure. And although that might sound really boring to people who are into music and you would always want it to be a little more free and a little more unwieldy, no, 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 no. All the Doors records, the Zeppelin records, they all had structure. All of those guys understood the importance of structure in whatever way you manifested it. So I think that was a big deal. That the song could protect the song. It could change it if it needed to be changed in the process, but respect what was innately magical about it.
I mean, it's almost like knowing the rules in order to break the rules.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And that's why I was saying about Jimmy Page being a session guitarist on jazz sessions. And here's Jimmy Page, who, practically single-handedly invented Mel, I think. So, I think that there is a lot to be said for having, when I say a musical education, that can often be self-taught. In fact, in my case, it really was self-taught. I was useless at learning theory and having lessons, but that kind of education, in tandem with having respect for what has come before, I think is very important to making something that's going to last.
I mean, it's also, you mentioned the Beatles, and of course, the Beatles writing their own songs, and that's something that obviously uh, impacted you and influenced you. And you did say once, if I can't express it myself, it's meaningless
Yeah.
to me. So, is that still a rule for you that it has to be something that you need to express? Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Well, to a point. I mean, that's a really interesting question, Steve, because I still basically want to write. I want to perform what I write. I want to record what I write. I'm not interested in doing covers, and I'm not interested with writing for other people. I dabbled in it for a while, and I didn't like it. And and I think that's actually quite important. I make a point of stating that now because we're in an era now where the voice is we're told the voice is king, and it's all about how people sing and how they are stylistically and their technical ability, and how they appear on reality shows, TV shows, and how people respond to them. And that, to me, is, I mean, I'll be honest with you, Steve. It's going to sound a bit flippant, but anyone can sing. When I got signed to Rat Records, which was Mickey Mose's label, the legendary record producer Mickey. When he first heard me, he said, you've got a special voice. You've got an individual voice. You don't sound like anyone else. He said, I'm not talking about your technical ability. It's your sound. And that is what's going to help you communicate with people, let alone your songs. And I never forgot that. I never forgot that um, the what's important is an individuality. And I think we're in an era now where I do think that there's, a lot of people listen to a lot of people from now. When I was younger, I didn't listen to my peers. I didn't give a hell. I didn't give a damn about them. I enjoyed it, but I wanted to listen to the people I'd mentioned before. I wanted to listen to Eric Stewart. Wanted to listen to Justin Hayward. They were the gods to me. They still are.
Yeah,
So
you said before that your influences were from your father. You mentioned even Ravel and jazz, obviously. Then there's
yeah,
soul, funk, reggae, which came from your brothers. But I just wondered where or when did you start becoming, in a sense, aware of other themes in music that, political or environmental? Yeah, what's going on? Marvin Gaye, like there's so many amazing tracks that have
yeah,
obviously impacted you. There are so many other elements that are in music that seem to have been
yeah.
important to you.
Very important to me. And to be honest, that's also something that I've carried through with me throughout my life. That even if if I'm dragged kicking and screaming into writing a love song, which I do now and again, and I did when I was younger, but um, I always felt there were enough. There were enough love songs in the world. Did we really need another? I was more inspired by Marvin at his best. What's going on? Mercy, 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 mercy me. Stevie in the '70s, Inner Visions, Music of My Mind, fulfilling his first finale. All of this stuff. The Isley Brothers were a big thing for me. Harvest for the World was just it. And so for me, it was that combination. Music's about communication. I make music because I want to communicate. We're oddballs in music. We're not the guys that stand at the bar talking about the football match the other night. I like football, but we're too odd for that. We're misfits. And so you want to find a way to communicate with people, and you do it through music. And what you want to do is talk about the world, talk about the things that are really affecting us, as well as maybe relationships, fine. But I remember when I first heard Higher Ground, I just thought that I mean, apart from the fact that Stevie is drumming on it amazingly and playing all the other instruments, I just thought, what a fantastic concept. What an amazing song. And I still listen to it every so often just to remind me that that's kind of the seed of me writing, for example, our second hit with Johnny Hates Jazz, I Don't Want to Be a Hero, which is an anti-war song. It was really natural for me to do that. And sorry, Steve, it's a bit of an elongated answer, but you look back at the '80s, we were all kids of the '70s and '60s. So we all did that. Tears for Fears did it. Talk Talk did it. Tom Robinson did it. It was commonplace. It was not, oh, they've written a song about war or politics. That's a bit risque. And today it would be. But back then it certainly wasn't. It was just part and parcel of what you did if you were a musician.
But it was also that the songs had this sort of bittersweet tendency to them. Like maybe I can put it this way, that the lyrics and the actual song would have a different dynamic. So they were, maybe the song would feel happy. Shattered
Yeah.
Dreams feels happy. The
Yeah.
lyrics, are something else. And so it's this wonderful thing of two emotions playing through one song.
I really agree with that. And that's something that in some ways, I mean, I go back to Harvest for the World. That's a great example. That's no dirge. It's got a great feel and you want to clap along to it. but he's talking about hunger. It's an amazing thing. And I think that I often feel this when, we do our live shows and we finish with Shattered Dreams because it was our biggest hit. And everyone is singing at the top of their voices about you giving me nothing but shattered dreams. And it's very powerful and empowering, but actually it's quite a sad, self-destructive message. So it is an interesting thing, but I think that's part of the power of music. It's how we allow ourselves to express things that we're not able to express normally. Music has a way of touching us and releasing something that we're unable to normally. And I think that's part of how it works.
And how about then performance? Because I just wondered about your first performance on stage and how that impacted you and changed your mentality, if at all.
Yeah, my first performance, I guess, on a proper stage was in on the I think it was the Lyceum in London. I was a solo artist then. I was a solo artist actually. 17-year-old, didn't quite know what I was doing, and I performed this record I had out, my first single called "You Fooled Him Once Again," which you can find on the streaming services on an album called Funk Classics Volume One. How the hell did that happen? I don't know, but suddenly the stage was swarmed with you know young people afterwards who wanted my autograph, and I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't know what to do. It was a really odd thing. I thought I would know what to do, so it took a while to figure out the dynamic of audience and performer, and to be able to be really natural and not really perform in that way, to just be there as another human interacting with all these people who've come to hear what you have to say, which is a very, very magical thing. I've come to really appreciate it more as an older guy.
I mean, that performance was with Julie Roberts from Working Week, wasn't it? And I think also a couple of members of AdsWad were on stage with you. I
Yeah.
think that you weren't alone, but you said that interaction, the later having to sign autographs and the audience attention was illuminating.
Yeah.
What exactly uh, do you mean by that? Because some people feel that success, when they haven't been successful, that success is getting attention, and success can solve your problems in life, your issues. But for me, I always felt that when I was on MTV, it actually, doubled my issues and made them greater, really. It caused a greater problem.
Yeah, it's very well put, Steve. And you would know that MTV was so big at that time, and you were so prominent. So you know that feeling that actually, in a way, you think you're prepared for that. You think you're geared up for it. That first gig I was telling you about was me beginning my journey to understanding what it would be like to be a pop star. And I thought by the time I got there, I'd handle it fine. But actually, what happens is a lot of things come to the surface that you're not prepared for. You react to things that you wouldn't normally have to react to because they're unique experiences that we tend to happen in, especially in the arts, I think. And um, I think that what I found, I never thought necessarily that success or fame would solve my problems. I wanted to be appreciated. I think most musicians want to be appreciated at the bare minimum. Um, and I liked it. I enjoyed it, but I could never play the game. It was like it was. I saw a lot of other people who go headfirst into it, and it was, really was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And for me, it was this is going to sound potentially quite pretentious, but the music was too valuable for me to trash my sense of self in that lifestyle. I wanted to be present with the experience because I knew it wouldn't necessarily last forever. I wanted to be completely clear and feel that in years to come, I could look back and be proud of my actions. Um, I don't know if I can honestly say that I am completely, but I tried my best anyway.
I mean, that's really interesting to hear because you were so young. And
Yeah.
and I think when you're 18 or however old you were when it really started to kick off, then um, it feels like that's an incredibly mature response. And if I think of myself as an 18-year-old, wouldn't have been anything on that level. Um,
Well, I have to say in other ways, I was extremely immature. So I, I don't mean to, I wasn't Gandalf, but I certainly, all I'm saying is that I had a self-awareness which was helpful at that time.
Maybe it's also because you had a certain amount of experiences that led to Johnny Hates Jazz, and those experiences probably formed you um, and gave you something along the way. So it probably prepared you to a certain extent, such as working with Rusty Egan, for example, and then understanding that machines can impact a song and add to the texture of the song, then going to America to write. And that you were very young when you went to LA to write, didn't you? You wrote for Martha Reeves and I think the Drifters as well.
Yeah.
And just tell me about those two very different experiences and how they actually change your perspective of what you wanted.
Rusty was part of the Rich Kids and then Visage. So Fade to Grey was, Rusty was part of that immensely important record with Steve Strange and Midge, etc. And Rusty had heard my first single, and I smile. I'm smiling because Rusty is a real character. But he was very important. I still see him from time to time. He was very important to me. He's a real Cockney. He's done an awful lot for music, for electronic music especially. So when I met him, he basically put me in a room with a drum machine and a synthesizer and said, "Learn, experiment." And I wasn't really sure what to do until I saw on TV a live performance of the Thompson Twins doing "Love on Your Side." And "Love on Your Side" was like, I kind of thought, this is a great feel, but it's done with electronics. It's synths. It's amazing. And and that's kind of what tuned me into what I could do. You could utilize electronics in a very human way. And actually, and the magic thing about Rusty was, I remember he said to me, we were recording at Trident Studios in London, and he was doing some tracks with me, and me as a solo artist, and it was kind of this electronic funk thing. I was very into Rick James at the time, and um, this kid from Surrey. What was I thinking? I don't know, but it was great fun. And he said, "You know what? You're a superstar, but no one knows it." And I kind of blinked and looked at him, and no one had ever said that to me before or since. It was really what he was saying is, I've got faith in you. It was just Rusty's way of I didn't go away thinking, hey, I'm a superstar and I'm got, no, I didn't think that. It was just he's got faith in me. And Rusty actually sent me to LA to write for Warner Brothers, which is where I wrote for Martha Reeves and the Drifters. And so he was really important because when I came back from LA, I was 17, 18. I answered an advert in Melody Maker. Of course, back then we had, music newspapers, and I in the classified section there was an advert for a singer to join a band that was signed to a major label, which I thought was very interesting. So I actually played the band, or I sent in the recordings I'd done with Rusty, and they were very interested. And that band turned out to be signed to Rack Records, Mickey Most label, and I joined the band, got signed to Rack Records in my own right, and that's how Johnny Hates Jazz came to being. So Rusty was fundamental. LA was just a question of me growing up a bit, which I did. It was an amazing time to be out there. But yeah, I brought Rusty on stage a few years ago at a festival that we were playing at, and thanked him in front of thousands of people and played "Turn Back the Clock" for him. because he had been very important to me.
Don't go away. Much more with Clark coming up. Just time for me to tell you that all the interviews are at www.popthehistorymakers.com. Don't miss that because I think there's about 150 now and really worth watching. Okay, let's get back to Clark. You mentioned that you came back from LA and then you answered an advert, you got into the band Hot Club, which was a Mickey Mouse band, essentially. And in that band were Glen Matlock and Calvin Hayes. And of course, Glen Matlock, famously in the Pistols, and interestingly, because you have such an eclectic taste in music, Glen Matlock using the lick from SOS ABBA in Pretty Vacant, which is one of the most
Brilliant.
amazing things to connect ABBA and the Sex Pistols.
Glenn says that it was the reason that he was kicked out of the Pistols was that he declared his love for ABBA, which ironically, I know that feeling because I loved ABBA. They were the first band that I ever went to see live. Didn't sound like them eventually, but I loved them. And Glenn, of course, he co-wrote or wrote the most iconic Pistols tracks. And I still kind of feel a bit sad that Sid Vicious got all the attention he did when actually Glenn was really the creative force there. But it was a really interesting band. And we also had James Stevenson in the band, who was in Generation X and Chelsea, and then Gene Loves Jezebel. I've been in touch with James recently, actually. So we all kind of see each other now and again. I saw Glenn not that long ago, looking immaculate. This guy from the Pistols is wearing this powder blue suit. And he's very tanned, and but good people. And I was very fortunate to have the experience I did. And as you said, the other member, Calvin Hayes, who was Mickey Most's son, was the drummer in the band and ended up 4 years later forming Johnny Hates Jazz with me and Mike Nocito. So it's amazing how one door closes, another door opens. And that's what happened for me a lot.
Yeah, Mickey sent you off to work with Mike Nocito, didn't he, to sort of record the demos that you had already had.
Yeah.
And he was working as an engineer, I understand. So what did he recognize? I mean, I presume you didn't know him that well when until you got into this band. But what did Mike understand about your songs?
I'm not sure at the beginning. Mike kind of got to know me as he was a fledgling engineer and I was a fledgling, solo artist. And he knew that, I mean, we shared a lot of musical interest in as much as I guess we kind of met on, when it came to Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers and that kind of thing. And so he understood that the chords that I used when I wrote songs were maybe not typical of pop songwriting. I tended to be a little more unusual, and Mike really got that. And he liked the fact that I was trying to find a way to bring that into music, often electronic music, in a way that was uncommon. But we also, I think we just got along as people as well. We were both in this very interesting world of Rack Studios in St. John's Wood, which is still there. And, you had, Susie Quattro, you had Hot Chocolate, you had Kim Wilde, and they were just the people signed to Rack. You had all these people coming in and out recording there. It was a really amazing environment to be a part of. And I think both Mike and I felt that there was something more to be had out of that environment, but we weren't quite sure what it was.
And also, it wasn't right at the exact time that it could happen, was it? Because they were already working with a singer at that point, Phil Thornalley.
Yeah.
And then he wasn't available. So can you tell me about that and how that sort of transformed into you being a part of that record, Me and My Foolish Heart?
Yeah. So Phil was the chief engineer at Rack Studios, went on to become a very successful writer producer, and is a good mate. But at the time, I didn't know Phil well. he, Mike and Calvin had become a production team, and they were experimenting with different ideas. And they had this one idea that they asked Phil to see if he could come up with a melody for. So it was an instrumental idea. Phil came in, literally, I think he said to me he had one or two goes at just meandering through the song. He hadn't written anything, he was making things up and he went along. And that was it. He was never really part of the band. There wasn't a band as such. And when Mike and Calvin wanted to work further on it, Phil, it really wasn't his thing. He had other work to do. He was committed to do things as a producer engineer. He'd already produced, I think, at that point, Prefab Sprout, the album with When Love Breaks Down. So he was kind of on his path. And ironically, at the same time, Rack Records had been the running of Rack Records has been handed over to an external individual instead of Mickey. Mickey was always a bit of a champion of mine, but this new guy booted me off the label. And I remember walking out of his office, and Mickey came out of his office and said, "I'm sorry, Clark, there's nothing I can do. If I'm going to give control to this guy, I've got to give it 100%." So I walked down the stairs of Rack Studios, heading for the exit, and I heard this track coming out of Rack Studio 2, which was Me and My Foolish Heart. And I walked in. Of course, I knew Mike and Calvin well. I said, "What's that you're working on?" So they explained, and they said, but Phil can't do it and everything. And I said, "Well, if you ever feel like you want me to have a crack at it, let me know." And out I went. 6 weeks later, I was the singer in Johnny Hates Jazz, and the guy who ran Rack Records couldn't believe it. He said, "Well, I didn't expect you back quite so soon, Mark."
How did you feel in those 6 weeks?
I felt really crushed because it was a big thing to have a record label. It was hope. It was a sense that you had a potential door to do something special. And without a label, there was no hope. Like I said, pre-streaming services, forget it. But it wasn't long before Mike and Calvin were knocking at my door saying, "Look, do you want to give this a go?" And I had not sung other people's songs before. So it was like, all right, I'll give it a go. And I did that, and it kind of works. And Me and My Foolish Heart came out on Rack Records. It wasn't a hit, but it was critically well received. So much so that we thought, well, let's do something else. So I said, "Well, look, why don't I write some songs and let's see what happens?" Because that's what I was, a songwriter, essentially. So I went away, and the first song I came up with was Shattered Dreams. And I remember the two guys heard it, and they said, "I think we should record this. I think we're onto something." And so that was the beginning of Johnny Hates Jazz.
When you write, do you look for the universal in something personal?
You have to, I think, because that's the only way you can communicate with people. I mean, the idea of baring your soul and talking about how your girlfriend or boyfriend, dumped you, or whatever the kind of things that a lot of people seem to spend time pondering in their songwriting, it will only resonate if it's done in such a way that it can connect with other people and their experiences. So I think you always have to be aware of that. But in another way, I mean, I'll never forget, Tori Amos Winter, where it's hyper poetic. And if you don't know what the song's about, it's just hyper poetic. It's a remarkable piece of music because the music itself is what connects you. So I think that in some ways, if you can do both, great. But as long as one of those things are doing their job, then you can talk about the personal in an all-encompassing way and communicate with a lot of people.
Although it took a while for it to be successful, there was a sort of rolling sort of success with the band over a period of time and around the world. It wasn't something that just ended up being in Britain. You were incredibly successful, in America and all around Europe, and you were on MTV uh, endlessly at that period. And I just wonder whether MTV also had a negative impact on you, because MTV was as much about image as it was about music. And I think by being so much about image, it could trap the artist into a version of themselves that maybe they weren't. Do you know? The first version you present is the version you're going to end up with.
Yeah, I know, and I think that was an accusation that was leveled at MTV quite a lot. I view it very differently. I thought MTV was actually pretty cool, and the reason I say that is that it allowed the artist, unless they were totally malleable and willing to be shaped and formed by some external force. Most of us wrote our own music. I wrote the songs. Mike and Calvin produced. We played the instruments. We managed ourselves. We were very self-sufficient. So, and I used to dress in designer suits and ties, etc., from when I was quite young. And I'd go everywhere I went, I dressed like that. I didn't dress like that for the cameras. I'd show up, I'd go to the shops like that. I'd show up in the studio like that. At Rack Studios, they were always quite bemused that I would stroll in dressed up to the nines. And in some ways, I got that from Rusty, because Rusty would do that. He would walk around looking immaculate, but he was the same. He was the same with everyone. There wasn't a different version of Rusty, and I really liked that. And so MTV was just an extension of that. Very cool. The first video we did for Shattered Dreams, I didn't like, and I remember watching it back with Mike and Calvin, and we looked at each other and I thought, "Oh dear, we we need to have more say in what we do next." But then we ended up working with David Fincher and Dominic Senna, and we made some good videos, and they were great experiences, and they've kind of become part and parcel of how people experience the songs. So I'm actually grateful for MTV.
You left Johnny Hate Jazz at the height of the fame, really. And I wonder whether you look back and think that as an act of courage or the sort of state of confusion.
I think it was both. I think it was. I can't say that it was one or the other. It was courageous in the sense that I was really two things. I was very unhappy with how we were being promoted to the British press and how the British press responded. We weren't promoted like that elsewhere in the world. We were. Remember our first interview in Italy? We sat down and the interviewer said, the journalist said, "So the British Steely Dan," and we kind of thought, well, that's a lovely thing to say. I don't think we were as close to Steely Dan as those heights, but we were certainly influenced. So that was lovely. That would never have been said in Britain. It was much more of a cynical environment, although it has become our most loyal country without a doubt. So I have huge love for Britain, but so I found that hard. But also we were managing ourselves, as I alluded to earlier. So that meant we couldn't just be a band. We had to become businessmen as well. And that brings out different things in different people. Not necessarily right or wrong, just different. And it led to all kinds of clashes that I found too difficult to come to terms with. So I jumped ship, and we'd had a number 2 hit in the US with Shattered Dreams. It was a crazy time to go. And there were a good few people in the business in Virgin who tried to talk me out of it, and I was too headstrong. So, it was it right or wrong? Was it intelligent or unwise? It was all of those things.
Was it also to do with environmentalism because it's something that is so close to your heart? And in a sense, like giving you the opportunity to try a different path that maybe is closer to how you've grown?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I wanted more and more songs to have more social relevance. And I do think at the time that Mike and Calvin were worried about that. They'd seen, even though I Don't Want to Be a Hero had done us proud, and it's resonated all these years later with people, especially service personnel, ex-service personnel, and serving service personnel that often come up to me after gigs and want to talk to me about it. I think they felt I was possibly going too fast, too quick. Sorry, too fast, too quick. Too fast with heading in that direction. And I was impatient. So that was definitely played into it. I wanted to, tackle issues in music, and I did so later on my own. Um, and I introduced it into Johnny Hates Jazz when we reformed in 2009. I think by that time, Mike especially accepted that. He just said, "Look, just do it in a way where I feel I can possess it as well," which is what I've tried to do.
That's a beautiful thing for him to say, because you'd been at Real World Studios, you'd been, you made a number of albums, you'd learned different musical cultures, you'd learned different musical instruments. We mentioned just before the interview the bouzouki.
Mm.
So had music in that period become more about healing than entertainment?
Yeah, I think so. Healing myself first and foremost. Because leaving Johnny Hates Jazz and walking away from that level of appreciation by the public was massive. It was a big thing to do, and I think in a way, it broke me a bit, even though I'd made that decision. So there was a desire to find a greater sense of meaning in making music, and I know I'm not alone in that. Other people have done it, and it probably sounds like quite a almost contrived pathway that certain people do. I think Terence Trent D'Arby kind of had his own version of that. But it was interesting because I lived up the road from Real World Studios, just outside of Bath. I had a studio there, at the studio complex. I was immersed in that whole world music thing that Peter Gabriel was bringing to the fore, and it became actually the 90s. Although the 1980s were given short shrift by the 90s, it was definitely a decade that wanted to trash what had come before, which I think actually tends to happen no matter what. But the 90s did a real number on the 80s. And, I didn't ever talk about being in Johnny Hates Jazz. I felt it was, I remember Calvin said to me when we met years later, he said, I felt like a criminal, like I couldn't talk about it. Now everyone's going, oh, the 80s, that was the time, but it wasn't like that in the 90s. So anyway, my point is that I needed to find another reason to still make music. And I think I found it in that time in Bath, and learning instruments that are evocative of the land as opposed to evocative of a musical style. And interestingly, the bouzouki, which of course is, as we know best of all as a Greek instrument, but I played the Irish version, is one of those instruments that it's kind of a pan global instrument. It speaks to different people everywhere. There's always some version of that instrument, whether ancient or modern, and it kind of helped me to communicate. I'd like to think on a bigger level and a deeper level. Bouzouki became really important to me, actually. I keep looking over there because I've got 5 of them over there. I was really into it. Got 5 of them over there by my piano. So yeah, but that was also, I have to say, sorry, Steve, to be rambling here, but that was the magic of the 90s as well. I sounded probably a little bit negative about it, but one of the cool things about it was that the New Age movement was allowing music that hadn't really been heard before to come to into the light, and that was really it was a magical time in some ways, and I kind of miss that being part of our world today. Deep Forest or Enigma, they were big things and they were great records, and they were really innately, there was something spiritual about them without banging anyone over the head with what they were about or where they were coming from. And I miss that today. It's something that I would like to one day kind of venture back into.
It was also introducing the audience to sounds they weren't necessarily familiar with. And I find that really interesting because, as a you know that I'm in Athens, and hearing Greek music here, and I mean Greek contemporary pop music, which includes different sounds than I was used to as a child. So it's something that you have to get used to first before you can really sort of comprehend and understand and fall in love with.
Totally. I mean, that must be amazing over there. I listen to a few Greek artists whose names I can't pronounce, which is really frustrating. But I do find that, and again, I think it's interesting that the a lot of the avenues to experiencing those instruments and that sensibility came from just a very few artists. One of them was Lorena McKennitt, who, at the time, Canadian artist, kind of invented this idea of self-releasing your music. Lorena McKennitt was incredibly important in the evolution of how music has come to be now. But she was already experimenting with world instrumentation in the same way that Peter Gabriel was. But I think she was actually more far reaching in many ways. She didn't have the history that Gabriel had, that she kind of was still bound to. And and I think it's now become kind of, it's part of our world, but it's almost a bit underground still because pop music is still so dominant, especially the kind of pop music that exists today. So I hope that there will be a way to bring that back into the realm of pop because that's what I always wanted to happen.
I was listening to your latest single today with Jaki Graham, who I've always loved, it's just brilliant, Soul Believer. And what's fascinating after talking for this hour is that that song is built around all the references that we've already talked about.
Yeah,
It's like a love letter.
it is a love letter to the soul music of the 60s and 70s that we all grew up listening to. And not only that, I could have done it, it could have been Rock Believer, but it was, we wanted to do something about soul music. And so yeah, the lyrics are made up nearly exclusively of the song titles of classic soul songs from those eras. And there's a few passing phrases, but not many. If you didn't know that, you just hear it as a lyric. But when you do know it, I think people will be quite surprised and hopefully find it endearing. But it was it was something that me and Mike always wanted to do. We did an album called Wide Awake in 2020, which where we wanted to just be influenced by the music we grew up listening to. And interestingly, at that time, we had a jam session with Hamish Stuart, one of the founding members of the Average White Band, who I was a big fan of. And from that jam session, I wrote this song called Soul Believer. And Hamish came up with this killer bass part for it. And but then the pandemic happened and we couldn't finish it. So it kind of sat around for a while, waiting for me and or Mike to put energy into it. Eventually we did. And when we finished it, it was this feeling of, you know what, it's not quite complete and I don't know why. And a short while later, we were backstage at a music festival in London called Uptown Festival. And Jaki was on the bill with us. And we met Jaki backstage and it was like, bang, instant. Mutual Appreciation Society. I owned some of Jaki's records. I was a big fan. I didn't know she loved Johnny Hates Jazz, and she did. So we hit it off. And then me and Mike went away a few days later, said, should we ask Jaki? So we played it to her, and she just said, I love it. I'm, I'll get in the car and I'm coming down and do a vocal. And we did, and it was finished. It was like, somehow it almost felt like our paths are meant to be together for this period of time. So me and Jaki are doing a podcast. Actually, we're starting a podcast called Soul Believers about the history of soul music. So it's kind of accelerated into this thing which I don't quite know what it's going to be, but it's pretty cool, and I'm really happy with the record. It's probably the most feel good record I've ever been part of.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great track. And also what I love about it is, what we've already said about intertwining all those titles or, partial lyrics of songs from the past, but they're also the songs that really taught, I'm going to say us, how music communicates.
Totally, totally. And I wish I could have included more songs, actually, more song titles, because they deserve to be there. But that's right. It was an amazing era for music. Whether it was rock, soul, pop, country, jazz, whatever it was, amazing music. And it was very important to include certain artists for me, like Marvin Gaye, because Marvin, for me, was important when he wrote about important things. But the sexual healing Marvin was of no interest to me. It's like, why? What are you doing, man? You did What's Going On. That was one of the most revolutionary songs ever. It was beautiful. It was so non-judgmental. Just ask that question. That song taught me to ask questions rather than make statements. And anyway, so I included it. I'm going off on a tangent. The Isley Brothers, I think I've got Summer Breeze in there. It could have been other songs. I love the Isleys. And on and on. And I've included Young Americans in there. Bowie. Because when Young Americans came out, there was a hoo-ha. Bowie's doing a soul record. It can't be a soul record because it's David Bowie. Well, I'm sorry, it is a soul record. And what a great soul record it was. So we included all of that. Carole King, You've Got a Friend. Because soul is a broad thing to me. It was not, we weren't tribal. Michael McDonald is totally soul. Come on, man, that voice, So it really is a love letter to that music, and the fact that it hasn't survived in that form. Of course, neo soul's become something else, and that's okay. But I want to relate to what touched me so much, and I think what touches a younger generation still to this day. So again, having Jackie being a voice on there is kind of a voice from, yeah, she was at the same time as us, but she represents that whole world of soul music to me.
You rejoined Johnny Hates Jazz quite a while ago, and of course, with all these, with performing on stage and the 80s tours and things like that, I just wondered how performing those songs from your past has changed the relationship you have today with the young man you were who wrote them.
Mm. That's beautifully put, Steve. That's very. I like how you put that because it is as deep as that. I'm listening. I'm singing songs that I wrote when I was a much less formed part of myself, and I understand myself much better. I mean, there are times when I think, would I have expressed myself in the same way if I'd written that song now? And the answer is often no. But it doesn't matter because it makes me find how I can then explain to the audience what I was trying to say. I don't want to be a hero being a great case in point. Um, and and in a way, I appreciate the efforts that I made a lot more than I used to because I've realized that those songs have resonated with people. I used to never really, I'll be honest with you, Steve, I was not a great fan of Turn Back the Clock. I wrote it and it did really well, but I always thought it was a bit there was something about it that I thought was a bit naive and didn't incorporate the fact that a lot of people don't want to turn back the clock and they've had rough pasts and upbringings and they prefer now, the present. And I've learned to talk to people about that, to explain that really it's about acknowledging our journeys, and it's our journeys and all the experiences we have, the good, the bad, and the ugly, that make us who we are. And if we're to embrace who we are, we need to embrace our journeys. So that's kind of how I've translated that. So it is a wonderful thing to be performing those songs today because you get into the psychology of who you were and who you are now and who people are now and who they were as well. It's an amazing dynamic audience performer.
Yeah, and I think it changes your view of success. What you originally set out for means something completely different today.
It really does, and it has to, because the world's changed so much. We're we're all a little bit older, and so the way success is going to manifest itself is going to be different. But at the same time, when I'll never forget, we performed "I Don't Want to Be a Hero" in a place in Britain a couple of years ago on a tour. And I had someone come up to me afterwards. We always meet the audience if we can afterwards. A guy came up who was absolutely in tears, shaking. And he explained that he used to be in the armed forces. And he had been in the Iraq War. And what I'd said about the song beforehand and then the song itself just opened him up emotionally. And that was incredibly moving to me, who's never been in the armed forces, never seen conflict like that. Only imagined it to have someone who had been there say to me, what you said was important. It mattered to me because it made me feel that I was seen. And that really is when you walk away thinking, I did okay. I did okay.
Well, it's been brilliant to talk to you, Clark Datchler. What I really want to say at the end is to thank you for your contribution to popular culture, because I think it's really important, like this guy in essence has done, that we say very openly to artists, thank you for your contribution, because it's a part of our lives and it has been a part of my life. And it's a very important part of my life. So at the end, I just want to say thank you.
Steve, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.